Hi, boys and girls. This is Grandma Sheila, and I have a story today for you from the far off country of Africa. Well, our story is called The Chief's Daughter. The main person in our story was David Livingstone, who was a missionary for 30-some years to the big country of Africa. Well, on this day, he had been at the mission where he and his best friend, a young black man that went everywhere with him, they had gotten a message from a village that they had never been to before. Not that they hadn't wanted to or tried to go there to tell the people about the one God in heaven, but because the chief wouldn't let them come. Well, today they had received a call from that chief to come to his village. Well, they were excited, David and his young friend. When they got there, the village was a nice-looking village. The houses were all in a nice circle, and the chief's hut was probably twice as big as the other huts, and all of them had thatched roofs all the way on them. And the ground around the huts and between it was all smooth and flat dirt. It looked like somebody had swept it. Maybe they had. It stayed packed down by the feet of all those African people walking on it. Well, when they got into the village, a couple guards came out. They were big men. They were dressed with feathers on their heads, and their faces and stuff were painted, and they had big spears, and they looked like they meant business. They looked at David Livingstone and his helper. David said, "I've come to see your chief." So they led them to the house of the chief. He was sitting in front of it on his throne that sat on the outside of the house. David Livingstone, he looked at the chief and he called out to him. In their country, all chiefs had their own greeting. And his greeting was, "Oh, great elephant." And it went on and on. Well, when the chief nodded, that missionary doctor and that young man that was with him, they approached that chief. And David could see that something was not right here. The chief looked sad. And David, he kind of bowed his head to the chief, and he said, "You called for us?" And the chief said, "Yes, my daughter is very sick. I called you here. I demand you give her medicine to make her well." And David said, "I will be glad to do everything I can do. I am a doctor. I'll try to help her. But as far as healing her, the God of heaven's the only one that I know of that can heal people." He said, "Could I see your little girl?" He went inside the hut. It was dark, and he had to adjust his eyes to be able to see. Finally, he saw the little girl laying on a whole pile of leopard skins in the corner, and she was all curled up, and she was moaning, "Oh, oh, oh." Well, Dr. David, he went over and he knelt down beside her and he said, "Hello, little princess. What's the matter?" And she just moaned, "My tummy hurts." Well, Dr. David, he said, can I feel it? First of all, he felt her head, and she was burning up with fever. Then he gently pushed on her tummy. He knew right away what was wrong. He went out to the chief and he said, Chief, your daughter has a disease called appendicitis. Now, an appendix is a little round thing way low down below her tummy. It can get sick, and the only way to make her well again is for me to take that appendix out. So he got his doctor bag that he always brought with him, and he opened it, and he took out a sharp knife, and he said, I need to make a little hole in her tummy. Then I can take out that bad thing that's in there that's making her sick. And then he held up a needle and thread, and he said, when I'm all done, I'll sew that hole right back up. Now she'll sleep for a while after I'm done, because I will give her medicine to make her sleep so she doesn't hurt while I do it. The chief looked at her, and the chief's wife and all the ladies of the village were standing around the little girl, and they started going, oh, oh, oh. The chief, he didn't look too pleased either. But then David said, you know, if we don't take that bad thing out, it will burst open and she'll die. The chief looked at him and he said, if my daughter dies, you die. Well, David said, we'll do this as quick as we can. And if your daughter dies, you can kill me. Well, the chief nodded his head in agreement. He said, do what you have to do quickly. So David, he said, I need some boiling water, because he had to put all his instruments in the boiling water to make sure they were nice and clean so he wouldn't give the little girl an infection. So while they were doing that, Dr. Livingston and his friend, they knelt down to talk to the God of heaven. They prayed earnestly that God would heal this little girl. And then they prayed that if it was his will and he'd healed her, that God would touch the chief's heart so Dr. David could tell the people about the one true God. When they got done praying and they got those instruments all together, then David went in to do that little surgery. He gave the little girl just 2 drops of medicine that he had with him, and she went sound asleep. Well, then he got busy, and it didn't take him long to finish that and sew that little girl's tummy back up. And then he went to the parents and he said, it's all done. I took the bad thing out and I sewed her all back up, but she's going to sleep for a while from the medicine I gave her. So we will stay right here and wait, and we'll see how she is when she wakes up. Well, all the people from the village had been standing around watching and oohing and awing and moaning. Well, they looked around and it was getting really hot outside. So they all went back to their huts to take their afternoon nap in the shade. David, he sat on one side with his hand on the little girl's pulse, and he could feel the beat, beat, beat beat of the little girl's heart. He knew that she was doing all right, and he felt her head, and it was nice and cool. He sat right by that little girl to wait till she got better. And while he was sitting there, he looked around and he was remembering why he was there in Africa in the first place. He got to thinking about to when he was a little boy. He had come from a very poor family in Scotland. And when he was 10 years old, 10, he had had to go work in a factory. He had worked in a factory that made cotton rope. And he had 120 machines that little boy had to watch. And if any strings came out the wrong place, he had to attach everything back together. And he would walk round and round and round all day from 6 o'clock in the morning till 8 o'clock at night, making sure those machines were doing what they were supposed to do. But sometimes there was a day when things went well, and David, at age 10, started reading everything he could find. He read all about science. He read all about the foreign countries, all about the people and their lands and diseases and doctoring things, till finally, when he was all grown up, he decided to be a missionary doctor in the country of Africa. David, he was thinking about all that, and he thought, that's why I'm here now, to tell other people about Jesus and help make them well. He reached over and he felt that little girl's pulse again. Everything seemed to be going just fine, and the chief and his wife were just sitting there watching intently their little girl. Well, then it was getting very warm. And David thought, well, maybe I should just lean against the edge of the hut here, the wall, and maybe rest a little bit. Well, then he got to thinking about, he was kind of in danger here. If this little girl didn't get well, he knew that he would be killed. That reminded him of a time years ago when one day he'd been at the mission and a whole group from a village close there had come and asked Dr. David and his young friend if they would come on a lion hunt with them. Their cattle and everything were being destroyed by a big pride of lions. Well, David and his friend agreed, and they brought their guns, and the men from the village all came, and they brought their spears, and they made a big circle, and they waited for that lion to come. The men had their spears, and they also had torches. The reason for the torches was to scare all the lions away if they could. Well, as they waited, they could hear the lions coming, a whole group of them. Then one of them, a huge lion that must have weighed 400 pounds, came running. Dr. David, he took his gun and he shot that lion, and the lion fell over, and they assumed that the lion was dead. Well, in those days, the guns they had only had one shot in them, and you had to reload between. Well, he started to reload that gun, and that lion wasn't dead. It jumped up and it ran toward Dr. David, and it stood up on its back feet and it roared. And then all the other lions ran away from the shot of that gun. But that lion jumped on David and grabbed his shoulder in its mouth and started to shake David just like it was an old rug. David didn't know if he was going to survive or not. Well, his friend, he knew he didn't dare shoot at the lion because he might shoot David. So he put his gun so it shot straight up in the air and he started shooting. Well, the shot of that gun startled that lion and he dropped David. Well, he must have been hurt worse than anybody knew because he fell down right at David's feet, dead. David thought, you know, if I didn't have the God of heaven to help me, I surely would have been dead a long time ago. Well, then he looked over at that little girl, the little chief's daughter, and she was rubbing her eyes. And her eyes fluttered open. And she looked over and she saw her mommy and she said, Mommy? She looked kind of puzzled. I don't think she could figure out what had happened to her. Then she saw her daddy and she went, Father, I'm thirsty. So they went and they got her a drink. And David checked her all over and he said, I think she's going to be good as new. We got it in time. If you had waited any longer, it probably would have burst and she would have died. But I think that the God of heaven is healing your daughter. Well, the chief looked at Dr. David and he said, I will have my people make a big feast and we will eat and then we will all sit down and you can tell me about the one God, the God of heaven. I want to hear about a God that really can heal people. Boys and girls, we have a wonderful God. All you have to do is pray to Him, and He will help you. You know, He helps the missionaries, but He'll help you right here, too. Thank you, boys and girls. I'll see you next week. Bye-bye.